Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of serving her country, but every door seemed to slam shut in her face. Growing up in a small Texas town, she watched her older brother deploy overseas while she struggled through basic training exercises that left her gasping for breath and questioning her abilities. The other recruits moved with confidence she couldn't seem to find, their bodies responding to commands hers refused to obey. Her first attempt at the military physical fitness test ended in disaster. While other candidates completed their push-ups with ease, Sarah's arms trembled after just 15 repetitions. Her 2-mile run time fell short by nearly 3 minutes, and the pull-up bar might as well have been made of molten steel for all the good her grip did her. The drill sergeant's disappointed shake of his head told her everything she needed to know before he even spoke the words that would echo in her mind for months to come. "Martinez, you're not cut out for this life. Some people are born warriors, and others need to find different ways to serve." The rejection letter arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt as gray as her future prospects. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, reading the formal language that essentially told her she wasn't good enough, strong enough, or fast enough to wear the uniform she'd dreamed of since childhood. Her parents tried to console her with suggestions about college or civilian career paths, but their words felt hollow against the weight of her shattered dreams. For weeks, Sarah found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about herself. Had she been fooling herself all these years? Were the doubts that crept into her mind during those long training runs actually realistic assessments of her limitations? She took a job at a local diner, serving coffee to truckers and listening to their stories about places she might never see, adventures she might never have. But something inside Sarah refused to accept defeat. Late at night, after her shift ended, and the diner grew quiet, she would run through the empty streets of her hometown. Her breathing came easier now, her stride felt more natural, and slowly she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't her potential, but her preparation. She started researching different branches of the military, different programs, different ways to prove that the person who had failed those first tests wasn't the real Sarah Martinez. The discovery of specialized training programs designed for candidates who needed extra preparation gave her a glimmer of hope. These weren't charity programs or easier alternatives, but intensive courses that pushed struggling recruits beyond their perceived limitations. Sarah learned about success stories of people who had transformed their bodies and minds through sheer determination and proper guidance. Her second application process began 6 months after her first rejection. This time, Sarah approached everything differently. She documented her training progress, sought advice from veterans in her community, and prepared not just her body, but her mind for the challenges ahead. The physical improvements were obvious. She could complete twice as many push-ups. Her run times had improved dramatically, and her confidence showed in the way she carried herself. However, even with her improvements, the second round of testing revealed gaps in her preparation that she hadn't anticipated. The obstacle course proved particularly challenging, requiring not just strength and endurance but tactical thinking and adaptability that she hadn't fully developed. While her basic fitness scores had improved significantly, the more complex, military exercises exposed her lack of combat training and strategic thinking. The feedback from her second attempt was more encouraging than the first, but still not enough to secure her acceptance into the program she wanted. The evaluators noted her determination and improvement, but suggested she needed more specialized training before attempting the full military qualification process. This time, instead of feeling defeated, Sarah felt motivated. She had proven to herself that growth was possible, and now she just needed to find the right environment to continue that growth. Her research into specialized military training programs led her to discover elite preparation courses run by former Special Forces members. These programs were designed for individuals who showed potential, but needed intensive development to meet military standards. The cost was significant, but Sarah had been saving money from her diner job specifically for this purpose. She knew this might be her last realistic chance to achieve her military dreams. The application process for the elite training program was unlike anything Sarah had experienced before. Instead of just testing her current abilities, the evaluators seemed More interested in her capacity for growth and her psychological resilience, they asked about her failures, her motivations, and her willingness to push beyond comfort zones that most people never even approach. When Sarah received the acceptance letter for the specialized training program, she felt a mixture of excitement and terror that she had never experienced before. The program would be conducted at a remote facility in Colorado, led by former Navy SEALs and other special operations veterans who had developed innovative training methods for preparing candidates for elite military service. The letter included a warning that many participants would not complete the program and that the physical and mental demands would exceed anything she had previously experienced. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the detailed list of equipment she would need and the physical preparation recommended before arrival. This wasn't just another attempt at military qualification. This was her chance to discover what she was truly capable of achieving. As she prepared to leave her small Texas town for the mountains of Colorado, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The failures that had once seemed like endings now appeared to be necessary steps in a larger process. She was no longer the same person who had struggled through those first basic training exercises. The question now wasn't whether she was good, enough as she was, but whether she was ready to become someone entirely different. The night before her departure, Sarah stood in her childhood bedroom, packing the few belongings she would take to Colorado. Her military dream was still alive, but it looked nothing like what she had originally imagined. Instead of following a traditional path, she was about to embark on a journey that would test every assumption she had about her own limitations and potential. The Colorado facility looked nothing like Sarah had imagined. Instead of a polished military base, she found herself at what appeared to be an abandoned ranch tucked into a valley surrounded by imposing mountain peaks. The buildings were weathered and functional rather than impressive, and the only sign identifying the location was a small metal plate beside the main gate that simply read, "Advanced Tactical Training." Commander Jake Morrison was waiting in the main building when Sarah arrived with the other 12 candidates who had been selected for this session. Morrison stood barely average height, but possessed the kind of presence that filled a room without him saying a word. His weathered face and calm gray eyes suggested someone who had seen more combat than most people could imagine. Yet he spoke with a quiet intensity rather than the shouting Sarah had expected from her previous military encounters. "You're here because traditional military training didn't work for you," Morrison began, his voice carrying easily through the sparse room. "That doesn't mean you're weak or incapable. It means you learn differently, and you need different methods to unlock your potential. Over the next 8 weeks, we're going to tear down every assumption you have about your limitations and rebuild you from the ground up." The first week nearly broke Sarah's resolve before the real training even began. Morrison's program started with what he called baseline destruction, a systematic process of pushing each candidate beyond their current capabilities to establish where their true breaking points lay. Sarah found herself attempting physical challenges that seemed impossible, carrying weighted packs up mountain trails that left her lungs burning, navigating obstacle courses in complete darkness, and enduring cold water immersion exercises that made her question her sanity. But Morrison's approach was unlike any training Sarah had previously experienced. Instead of simply demanding performance, he taught the candidates how to analyze their failures and extract useful information from each breakdown. When Sarah collapsed during a particularly brutal endurance run, Morrison didn't berate her for weakness. Instead, he sat beside her on the mountain trail and explained how her breathing pattern was working against her and how her mental approach to pain was limiting her physical capabilities. "Your body is capable of far more than your mind currently believes," Morrison told her as they watched the sunrise paint the mountain peaks gold and orange. "The problem isn't your muscles or your lungs. The problem is the conversation happening in your head when things get difficult. We're going to change that conversation." The mental training component proved even more challenging than the physical demands. Morrison introduced concepts from military psychology that helped candidates understand how fear, doubt, and negative self-talk could sabotage their performance before their bodies ever reached their actual limits. Sarah learned techniques for managing pain, maintaining focus under extreme stress, and pushing through psychological barriers that had previously seemed insurmountable. Week by week, Sarah began to notice changes that went far beyond improved fitness scores. Her approach to challenges fundamentally shifted as she learned to view obstacles as puzzles to solve, rather than walls to crash against. When faced with a rope climb that had defeated her multiple times, she stopped focusing on her previous failures and instead analyzed the technique used by successful candidates, eventually discovering that her grip and body positioning had been working against her, rather than with the rope's natural physics. The other candidates in her group came from diverse backgrounds, but they all shared similar stories of being told they weren't good enough for traditional military service. There was Marcus, a former college football player whose size worked against him in agility exercises. Elena, a marathon runner who struggled with upper body strength requirements. And David, a computer programmer who had never played sports but possessed an analytical mind that Morrison believed could be valuable in combat situations. Morrison's training methods drew from his years leading SEAL teams in various combat zones around the world. He had observed that the most effective soldiers weren't necessarily those with the best initial test scores, but rather those who could adapt, learn and maintain performance under conditions that broke down others. His program was designed to identify and develop these qualities in candidates who had been overlooked by conventional military assessment methods. The halfway point of the program marked a significant shift in training focus. Instead of individual challenges, Morrison began emphasizing team-based exercises that required candidates to work together under increasingly complex and stressful conditions. Sarah discovered that her analytical approach to problem-solving made her valuable in group situations, even when she wasn't the fastest or strongest team member. During one particularly memorable exercise, Sarah's team was tasked with moving through a simulated enemy territory while carrying a wounded teammate to safety. The scenario required not just physical endurance but tactical thinking, communication under stress, and the ability to adapt when their original plan proved inadequate. Sarah found herself naturally falling into a leadership role, coordinating her teammates' different strengths to overcome obstacles that would have been impossible for any individual to handle alone. Morrison observed these exercises from concealed positions, taking notes on each candidate's performance under various types of stress. Sarah began to notice that his evaluation criteria seemed different from traditional military assessments. He appeared less interested in raw physical performance and more focused on how candidates responded to failure, adapted to changing conditions, and supported their teammates during difficult moments. The mountain environment itself became a constant teacher. Colorado's altitude challenged everyone's cardiovascular systems, forcing adaptations that wouldn't have been necessary at sea level. Weather conditions changed rapidly, requiring flexibility and preparation that became second nature as the weeks progressed. Sarah learned to read terrain, plan routes, and assess environmental risks in ways that transformed her understanding of what military service actually involved. As the program's midpoint approached, Sarah realized that her original goal of simply passing military fitness tests had evolved into something much more ambitious. She was no longer just trying to meet minimum standards, but was discovering capabilities she had never suspected she possessed. The person who had failed those first basic training exercises felt like a different individual entirely, someone whose potential had been constrained by limited thinking rather than genuine physical limitations. Morrison's program was revealing that military effectiveness couldn't be measured by standardized tests alone, and that the qualities that made someone valuable in combat situations weren't always the same ones that showed up in traditional training environments. The turning point came during Week 5, when Morrison announced that the program would shift from training exercises to actual mission simulations. The candidates would be participating in joint operations with active military units conducting training exercises in the same mountain region. For Sarah, this represented the first opportunity to see how Morrison's unconventional training methods translated to real military environments. The joint exercise involved working alongside a Marine unit that was practicing mountain warfare tactics. Sarah's group was assigned to serve as civilian contractors providing intelligence support, which required them to navigate hostile terrain while gathering information about enemy positions without being detected by either the opposing force or their own military partners who weren't aware of their presence. Sarah found herself paired with Sergeant Mike Chen, a Marine with 3 combat deployments who initially viewed the civilian contractors with obvious skepticism. Chen had heard rumors about Morrison's program but remained doubtful that candidates who had failed standard military training could contribute meaningfully to actual operations, even simulated ones. "I've got nothing against people who want to serve," Chen confided to Sarah during their first briefing. "But there's a reason we have standards. Combat isn't a place for second chances or participation trophies." The first day of joint operations tested every skill Sarah had developed over the previous month. Her team's mission required infiltrating an area controlled by the opposing force, establishing an observation position, and maintaining surveillance for 12 hours without detection. The physical demands were manageable given her improved conditioning, but the mental pressure of knowing that real Marines were evaluating her performance added a dimension of stress she hadn't anticipated. Sarah's analytical approach proved valuable when her team encountered unexpected obstacles. The original infiltration route had been compromised by weather conditions that made the planned approach too dangerous to attempt. While other team members debated whether to abort the mission or push forward with the risky original plan, Sarah studied the terrain maps and identified an alternative route that would take longer but avoid the hazardous conditions entirely. Her suggestion initially met resistance from teammates who were concerned about falling behind schedule. But Sarah's careful analysis of timing factors convinced them that the safer route would actually allow them to reach their objective with energy, reserves intact rather than exhausted from fighting dangerous conditions. The decision proved crucial when they discovered that their observation mission would require them to remain alert and functional for longer than originally planned. During the surveillance phase, Sarah's attention to detail caught tactical movements that other observers had missed. Her background analyzing problems methodically translated well to identifying patterns in enemy behavior that revealed information about their overall strategy. Chen, monitoring their performance from a concealed position nearby, began to reassess his initial skepticism about Morrison's candidates. The joint exercise culminated in a scenario where Sarah's team had to coordinate with Chen's Marines to respond to a simulated emergency evacuation. A teammate had suffered what would have been a serious injury in actual combat conditions, and the combined teams needed to extract the casualty while avoiding capture by the opposing force that was actively hunting them. Sarah found herself in a leadership position she hadn't sought but naturally filled when the situation demanded decisive action. Her ability to analyze complex problems quickly proved invaluable as she coordinated between her civilian team and Chen's Marines, each group bringing different capabilities to the evacuation effort. The operation required splitting forces, creating diversions and timing multiple movements to converge at an extraction point without alerting enemy units to their activities. The successful completion of the evacuation scenario marked a significant shift in how the Marines viewed Morrison's candidates. Chen admitted to Sarah afterward that her performance had exceeded his expectations, and that several aspects of her approach to tactical problems had given him new perspectives on familiar challenges. "You think about situations differently than most people I've worked with," Chen observed as they conducted their after-action review. "It's not necessarily better or worse than traditional military thinking, but it's definitely valuable in complex situations where standard procedures don't quite fit." Morrison had been observing the joint exercises from multiple vantage points, evaluating not just his candidates' performance, but also how they integrated with conventional military units. Sarah's success in earning respect from experienced Marines validated his belief that effective military personnel could come from unconventional backgrounds and training paths. The feedback from the Marines participating in the exercise provided Morrison with valuable data about which aspects of his program were producing transferable skills and which areas needed adjustment. Sarah's combination of analytical thinking and determination had proven particularly effective, but Morrison noted that her success also depended on being placed in situations where those qualities could be utilized rather than overshadowed by traditional physical performance metrics. Following the joint exercise, Morrison pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation about her future options. Her performance had attracted attention from several military units that specialized in roles requiring analytical thinking and adaptability, rather than just physical prowess. Morrison explained that there were paths to military service that didn't follow traditional infantry models, opportunities that valued the exact qualities that Sarah had been developing. "The military is changing," Morrison told her as they hiked through the mountain terrain that had become familiar over the past weeks. "Modern warfare requires people who can think critically, adapt to unexpected situations, and work effectively with diverse teams. Your background and the skills you've developed here make you valuable in ways that traditional training doesn't always identify." Sarah learned that Morrison's program had been developed partly in response to military leaders recognizing that current recruitment and training methods were potentially overlooking candidates who could contribute significantly to modern military operations. Combat roles were becoming increasingly complex, requiring combinations of physical capability, technical knowledge, and analytical thinking that weren't always found in the same individuals. The revelation that there were military career paths suited to her developing skill set transformed Sarah's understanding of what military service could involve. Instead of trying to force herself into a traditional infantry role that emphasized her weaknesses, she could potentially find positions that utilized her strengths while still contributing meaningfully to military missions. As Week 5 concluded, Sarah realized that Morrison's program had not only developed her physical and mental capabilities, but had also helped her understand that military effectiveness took many different forms. The person who had failed those initial fitness tests had been trying to succeed in the wrong environment, not lacking the potential for military service entirely. Week 6 brought an unexpected announcement that would change everything Sarah thought she knew about her future. Morrison gathered the remaining candidates. Only 8 of the original 12 had made it this far, and informed them that they would be participating in a real-world mission rather than another training exercise. A natural disaster had struck a remote region of the state, and emergency responders needed additional personnel with specialized mountain training to assist in search and rescue operations. The mission would serve as both a final evaluation for Morrison's candidates and a genuine opportunity to contribute to saving lives. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror as Morrison outlined the details. Flash flooding had swept through several mountain communities, cutting off access roads and leaving dozens of people stranded in areas that conventional rescue teams couldn't safely reach. "This is what you've been training for," Morrison explained, his usual calm demeanor carrying an undercurrent of urgency that hadn't been present during training exercises. "Everything you've learned about navigation, teamwork, stress management, and problem-solving will be put to the test in conditions where your performance directly impacts whether people live or die." Sarah's team was assigned to search a remote canyon system where emergency communications had indicated possible survivors, but where the terrain was too dangerous for helicopter access. The area required technical rope work, swift water crossing techniques, and the ability to function effectively while carrying medical supplies and communication equipment that would be essential if they located survivors. The deployment began before dawn on a gray morning when fog hung low in the mountain valleys, limiting visibility and making navigation more challenging than during any of their training exercises. Sarah found herself carrying a 40-pound pack containing medical supplies, emergency food rations, and communication equipment, while navigating terrain that shifted between loose rock slides and muddy slopes made treacherous by recent rainfall. Her team included Elena, whose marathon running background had served her well throughout Morrison's program, and David, the former programmer, whose analytical approach to problem-solving had proven valuable in complex situations. The three had worked together effectively during training, but real-world conditions added layers of stress and unpredictability that no simulation could fully replicate. The first indication that they were dealing with actual emergency conditions came when they encountered a section of trail that had been completely washed out by flooding. What should have been a straightforward hiking path had become a steep-walled ravine, with rushing water at the bottom and no obvious way to cross safely. Sarah studied the situation, while Elena and David assessed their equipment and communication options. Using skills Morrison had taught her about analyzing terrain and risk assessment, Sarah identified a route that would require technical rope work but could safely get them across the damaged area. The solution required them to anchor their climbing rope to a sturdy tree, rappel down into the ravine, cross the rushing water at a narrow point where the current was manageable, then climb up the opposite wall using rock climbing techniques. They had practiced but never used in actual emergency conditions. The crossing took nearly 2 hours, but Sarah's careful planning and her team's execution got all three across safely with their equipment intact. However, the delay put them behind their planned schedule and meant they would be searching in increasingly difficult conditions as weather in the mountains continued to deteriorate throughout the day. When they finally reached the area where survivors had last been reported, Sarah's team discovered a situation more complex than their briefing had indicated. A family of 4, parents and 2 children, had been trapped when flooding destroyed the bridge that provided their only access to the main road. Their cabin was intact but surrounded by rushing water that made evacuation dangerous, and one family member appeared to be injured based on the signals they were able to exchange across the flood-swollen creek. Sarah realized that rescuing the trapped family would require capabilities beyond what she and her teammates could provide alone. They needed additional personnel, specialized medical equipment, and possibly helicopter support to safely evacuate an injured person from the isolated location. However, their radio communication with the main rescue coordination center was intermittent due to the mountain terrain and weather conditions. David's technical background proved crucial as he worked to establish reliable communication by repositioning their equipment and adjusting transmission settings to work around the interference. Elena's endurance became essential when they needed someone to make the dangerous trek back to higher ground, where radio signals could reach the coordination center reliably. Sarah found herself coordinating the overall rescue effort, analyzing the situation and developing plans that utilized each team member's strengths effectively. The rescue operation stretched into the evening hours, as additional teams arrived to assist with the technical aspects of evacuating the injured family member. Sarah's team had located the survivors and established communication with rescue coordination, but the actual evacuation required specialized equipment and medical personnel that took hours to reach the remote location. During the long wait, Sarah found herself serving as the primary communication link between the trapped family and the rescue teams working to reach them. The parents were understandably frightened, and their children were confused and scared by the dramatic changes to their familiar environment. Sarah's calm demeanor and clear communication helped maintain morale while emergency responders worked to overcome the technical challenges of reaching them safely. When helicopter evacuation finally became possible late that evening, Sarah's team played a crucial support role in coordinating ground operations that allowed the injured family member to be lifted to safety. The other family members were able to evacuate via the technical rope systems that additional rescue teams had established, ending a situation that could easily have resulted in tragedy. The successful completion of her first real-world mission provided Sarah with a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had experienced during training exercises. She had contributed meaningfully to saving lives, utilizing skills that Morrison's program had developed in her over the previous weeks. The combination of physical capability, analytical thinking, and ability to function under extreme stress had proven valuable in conditions that mattered beyond personal achievement. Morrison's evaluation of the rescue mission focused not just on successful outcomes, but on how each candidate had responded to the unpredictable challenges that real-world emergencies always present. Sarah's performance had demonstrated that she possessed the qualities necessary for military service in roles that required adaptability and complex problem-solving rather than just traditional physical capabilities. As the rescue teams returned to base that night, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her perspective had changed since arriving at Morrison's program weeks earlier. She was no longer trying to prove she could meet arbitrary fitness standards, but had instead discovered that she possessed capabilities that could contribute significantly to missions that mattered. The final weeks of Morrison's program brought an opportunity that Sarah had never imagined possible when she first arrived at the Colorado facility. Based on her performance during the rescue mission and throughout the training program, Morrison had arranged for her to participate in a pilot program being conducted by the Army's Special Operations Command. The program was designed to evaluate candidates for intelligence and reconnaissance roles that required the exact combination of analytical thinking and adaptability that Sarah had been developing. Colonel Rebecca Hayes, the officer overseeing the pilot program, arrived at Morrison's facility to conduct personal interviews with candidates being considered for the Special Operations track. Hayes had served multiple deployments in intelligence roles and understood that modern military operations increasingly required personnel who could think critically under pressure rather than simply execute predetermined plans. Traditional military training does an excellent job of preparing soldiers for conventional warfare scenarios, Hayes explained to Sarah during their interview. But current global security challenges often require capabilities that don't fit standard military templates. We need people who can analyze complex situations, adapt to unexpected developments, and work effectively in ambiguous environments where clear-cut solutions don't exist. Sarah learned that the pilot program would involve 6 months of specialized training followed by assignment to an intelligence unit preparing for deployment to a region where ongoing conflicts created constantly changing conditions. Her role would involve analyzing local political and social dynamics, identifying potential security threats, and providing tactical recommendations to commanders making decisions about troop movements and resource allocation. The opportunity represented exactly the kind of military service that could utilize Sarah's analytical strengths while contributing meaningfully to national security objectives. However, accepting the position would require her to commit to several years of military service and potentially dangerous deployments to areas where intelligence personnel faced significant risks from hostile forces. Hayes emphasized that the pilot program was experimental and that there were no guarantees about long-term career prospects or advancement opportunities. The military was testing whether candidates with unconventional backgrounds could successfully fill specialized roles, but the program's future depended on early participants proving that the approach was viable. Sarah's decision became more complex when she learned that Elena and David had also been offered positions in the pilot program, but in different specialties that matched their particular strengths. The three had become close during Morrison's program and had worked effectively as a team, but accepting these opportunities would likely separate them as their career paths diverged. Morrison encouraged Sarah to carefully consider all aspects of the decision rather than simply accepting based on excitement about the opportunity. He had seen promising candidates make hasty choices that ultimately led to disappointment when reality didn't match their expectations. The intelligence role Hayes described would be challenging in ways that were different from but potentially more demanding than traditional combat positions. Military intelligence work requires a different kind of mental toughness than what you've been developing here, Morrison explained during one of their final conversations. Physical challenges have clear endpoints. You either complete the mission or you don't. Intelligence work involves living with uncertainty, making decisions based on incomplete information, and accepting responsibility for recommendations that could affect other people's lives. The decision deadline coincided with the final graduation ceremony for Morrison's program. Of the original 12 candidates, only 6 had successfully completed all requirements, and Sarah was one of only 3 being offered opportunities for continued military training. The ceremony was attended by various military personnel who had been involved in evaluating the program's effectiveness, including several who were interested in recruiting successful candidates for their units. During the ceremony, Morrison presented each graduate with a detailed assessment of their capabilities and recommendations for military career paths that would utilize their developed strengths. Sarah's assessment highlighted her analytical abilities, adaptability under stress, and capacity for leadership in complex situations, but also noted areas where continued development would be necessary for success in intelligence roles. The assessment included specific recommendations about additional training that would prepare Sarah for the challenges she would face in intelligence work. Technical skills in data analysis and communication systems would need development, and she would need to become familiar with cultural and political dynamics in the regions where she might be deployed. Hayes offered Sarah a week to make her final decision about accepting the pilot program position, acknowledging that the choice represented a significant life commitment that shouldn't be made hastily. Sarah used the time to research intelligence careers, speak with personnel who had served in similar roles, and carefully consider whether this path aligned with her original motivations for seeking military service. The conversations with current and former intelligence personnel provided Sarah with realistic perspectives on both the rewards and challenges of the career path she was considering. Intelligence work offered opportunities to contribute to national security in meaningful ways, but it also involved personal sacrifices and stress levels that not everyone could handle long-term. Sarah's final decision was influenced by her realization that Morrison's program had fundamentally changed her understanding of what military service could involve. Instead of trying to force herself into traditional roles that emphasized her weaknesses, she now had the opportunity to pursue a career path that could utilize the analytical and problem-solving abilities that had always been her strengths. Pilot program represented a chance to prove that military effectiveness could take many different forms, and that valuable contributions to national security could come from people with unconventional backgrounds and training paths. For Sarah, accepting the opportunity meant not just pursuing a military career but potentially helping to expand future opportunities for others who had been told they weren't suitable for traditional military roles. Her acceptance of the intelligence pilot program position marked the end of her journey through Morrison's unconventional training program and the beginning of a military career that would look nothing like what she had originally envisioned when she first attempted to join the armed forces. The person who had failed those initial fitness tests was ready to begin a new chapter that would test her capabilities in ways she was only beginning to understand. As she prepared to leave Colorado for the next phase of her military training, Sarah reflected on how completely her perspective had changed over the previous 2 months. She was no longer trying to prove she could meet arbitrary standards, but instead was ready to discover how her unique combination of abilities could contribute to missions that genuinely mattered for national security and the safety of her fellow service members. 2 years later, Sarah found herself in a forward operating base in Eastern Europe, where her intelligence unit was supporting NATO operations in a region experiencing significant political instability. The specialized training she had received through the pilot program had prepared her for exactly this type of complex environment, where traditional military approaches needed to be supplemented with sophisticated analysis of local political and social dynamics. Her daily responsibilities involved analyzing intercepted communications, assessing the reliability of human intelligence sources, and providing tactical recommendations to commanders planning operations in areas where the distinction between civilian populations and hostile forces was often unclear. The analytical skills Morrison had helped her develop in the Colorado mountains now served her in evaluating threats and opportunities that could affect the safety of hundreds of military personnel. The transformation from someone who couldn't pass basic military fitness tests to a trusted intelligence analyst seemed almost impossible to believe. Yet Sarah's success in her current role validated Morrison's belief that military effectiveness could take many different forms. Her unconventional path to military service had ultimately led her to a position where her unique combination of capabilities made her more valuable than traditional infantry soldiers would have been. Colonel Hayes, who had recruited Sarah for the pilot program, visited the forward operating base to evaluate how the experimental intelligence program was performing in actual operational conditions. During their meeting, Hayes reviewed Sarah's contributions to recent operations and assessed whether the investment in unconventional training paths was producing results that justified continuing the program. Your analysis of the political situation in the northern districts prevented what could have been a significant tactical error, Hayes told Sarah as they reviewed recent mission reports. Traditional intelligence gathering had missed the tribal dynamics that made one of our planned operations likely to backfire. Your recommendations led to a revised approach that achieved our objectives without creating new problems with local populations. Sarah's success story had become part of the evidence Hayes was using to argue for expanding programs that recruited and trained military personnel from unconventional backgrounds. The pilot program had produced several success stories, but Sarah's case was particularly compelling because her initial failures in traditional military settings made her eventual achievements more dramatic and convincing to skeptical military leaders. However, Sarah's journey had also revealed ongoing challenges with integrating unconventionally trained personnel into military organizations that were still largely structured around traditional career paths and evaluation methods. Despite her proven capabilities, she sometimes encountered resistance from colleagues who questioned whether someone who had initially failed military fitness tests could be trusted with critical intelligence responsibilities. These challenges were slowly being addressed as successful personnel from Morrison's program, and similar initiatives demonstrated their value in actual operational settings. Military leadership was gradually recognizing that modern warfare required diverse capabilities that couldn't always be identified through conventional recruitment and training methods. Sarah's current assignment involved training newly arrived personnel in techniques for analyzing complex political environments, sharing knowledge she had gained through her unconventional path to military service. Teaching others helped her recognize how much she had grown since those first failed attempts at basic military training, and how Morrison's program had fundamentally changed her approach to challenges and problem-solving. The teaching responsibilities also connected her with other military personnel who had followed unconventional paths to their current positions. Elena had eventually specialized in logistics coordination for special operations, while David had become a communication systems specialist, whose programming background proved valuable in developing secure communication networks in challenging environments. Their reunion at the forward operating base provided an opportunity to reflect on how Morrison's program had affected their lives and military careers. All three had found ways to contribute meaningfully to military operations, using capabilities that traditional training hadn't identified or developed, validating Morrison's belief that the military was potentially overlooking valuable personnel by relying too heavily on standardized assessment methods. Morrison himself had continued developing his training program based on feedback from personnel who had completed it and gone on to successful military careers. The program had evolved from an experimental approach to helping individual candidates into a model being studied by military training institutions interested in improving their recruitment and development processes. Sarah learned that Morrison was working with military education specialists to develop training protocols that could be implemented more widely, potentially helping future candidates who faced similar challenges to those she had initially encountered. The goal was to create pathways for military service that could identify and develop diverse types of capability, rather than filtering candidates based on narrow physical performance criteria. The impact of Morrison's work extended beyond just the individuals who had completed his program. Military leaders were beginning to recognize that warfare was becoming increasingly complex, and that effective military organizations needed personnel with varied backgrounds and capabilities, rather than uniform training and experience. Sarah's current position allowed her to see firsthand how military operations benefited from having personnel with different perspectives and analytical approaches. The intelligence challenges she faced daily required exactly the kind of critical thinking and adaptability that Morrison's program had developed, capabilities that complemented rather than replaced traditional military skills. As she continued her military career, Sarah remained connected to Morrison's program as both a success story and a mentor for new candidates facing similar challenges to those she had initially encountered. Her journey from failed basic training candidate to successful intelligence analyst had become an example of how military service could be accessible to people with different types of capabilities and backgrounds. The letter Sarah wrote to her younger self on the second anniversary of completing Morrison's program captured the profound transformation her life had undergone. She wrote about how failure had ultimately become the foundation for a more meaningful form of success than she had originally imagined possible. "I thought military service meant proving I could do everything the same way as everyone else," she wrote, "but I learned that the military needs people who can think differently, solve problems creatively, and bring unique perspectives to complex challenges. My failures taught me more about my capabilities than my successes ever could have." Sarah's story had become part of the evidence supporting broader changes in how the military identified and developed personnel for modern operational requirements. Her success demonstrated that traditional assessment methods might be missing valuable candidates who could contribute significantly to national security objectives if given appropriate training and opportunities. The intelligence work that now Defined, Sarah's military career required her to constantly apply the lessons Morrison had taught about analyzing complex situations, adapting to unexpected developments, and maintaining effectiveness under conditions that challenged both physical and mental resilience. Every day brought new opportunities to utilize capabilities that her original military training attempts had never identified or developed. Looking back at her journey from a small Texas town to a forward operating base in Eastern Europe, Sarah recognized that her path to military service had been unconventional, but ultimately more valuable than following traditional routes would have been. The challenges she had faced and overcome had prepared her for responsibilities that required exactly the combination of determination, analytical thinking, and adaptability that Morrison's program had developed. Her current position also allowed her to influence future military training and recruitment policies by serving as an example of what was possible when military organizations remained open to diverse backgrounds and unconventional approaches to developing personnel. Sarah's success story was helping to create opportunities for others who might otherwise be overlooked by traditional military assessment methods. The transformation from someone who couldn't complete basic fitness requirements to a trusted intelligence analyst serving in operational conditions represented more than just personal achievement. It demonstrated that military effectiveness could take many forms and that valuable contributions to national security could come from unexpected sources. When proper training and opportunities were provided, Sarah's story continued to evolve as she advanced in her military career, but the foundation laid by Morrison's program remained central to her approach to challenges and her understanding of what effective service could involve. The person who had once been told she wasn't cut out for military life had discovered that there were many different ways to serve effectively, and that her unique path had ultimately led her to exactly where she was meant to be.